One of the most difficult parts of getting your money working for you through investment is simply figuring out where to start. We live in a world where we're overwhelmed with information on a range of different topics, and the investment field really is no different. Over the years, as I've continued to learn more and more about investing, I found that one of the most effective ways to get those great investment ideas into my head is simply through reading. And I've also found that there's no secret strategy to guaranteed high returns with no risk or anything like that, but there is a well-beaten path that many people have taken historically that has worked very well and is likely to continue to work well moving forward. So in this video, I'd like to share 5 pieces of recommended reading from me to you that I think really cover the basics of investing very well and would certainly suit a beginner investor or potentially someone who's a little bit further along in the journey but feels that they still have a few kind of weaker areas that I'd like to work on. And this definitely isn't like a definitive list of must-read investment books or anything like that, but this is a set of materials that has really helped me personally build a strong investment framework over the past few years, one that I'm very comfortable with moving forward, and one that I think will serve me well probably for the rest of my life. And although I focus predominantly on stock market investments on this YouTube channel, the principles really apply to all types of investing, whether it be in the stock market, in real estate, or even in private businesses. For me, I've settled on more of a Warren Buffett long-term value investing approach to growing my money over time, so you will see that influence throughout this list, because frankly it's really the only method that's ever made sense to me rationally for making good returns over time without taking absurd levels of risk. And if a personal friend of mine was really serious about getting started with investing and becoming a better investor over time, this is sort of the list of 5 reading materials that I would point them towards as well. So if you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and perhaps even share it with a friend who you think might be interested in getting started on their investment journey. But without further ado, let's get straight into this list of top 5 reading materials for beginner investors. Now, the first book I have is this one, Invested by Phil and Danielle Town. Now, if you're not familiar with Phil Town, he is the author of a couple of different books, Rule 1 and Payback Time. I have both of those on the bookshelf behind me, and this is the 3rd book that Phil Town has written. This one is a little different because he actually wrote it with his daughter Danielle. Danielle actually started her career as a lawyer, working huge 80, 100-hour plus weeks, got exceptionally burnt out, and decided that she really needed to find a different path to kind of move forward in life. And that was actually the emphasis for Phil and Danielle to start a podcast together, where you would have Danielle, who really knew absolutely nothing about investing, and Phil Town, who had been investing successfully for decades and had taught thousands and thousands of people over the years the basics of investing. And I'm an avid listener of that podcast still to this day. It's called Invested. They put out episodes every week. And this book really summarizes the journey for Danielle and some of the key lessons that she'd learned along the way. And it's written in very plain and simple language that's easy for really anyone to understand. And I think it's a really nice place to start for absolute brand new beginner investors. Now, like I mentioned, I have also read Phil Town's other books, Rule 1 and Payback Time. I think they're good, but the lessons from those 2 books really are summarized and Invested, and Invested also adds a little bit of new stuff on top. So if you're going to pick any one of the 3, I would definitely jump straight to Invested. I think it's a really good place to start. The book does a really great job of breaking down some of the basic principles of value investing, like finding a business that you understand, that has a competitive advantage, that has good management, and that you can buy at a reasonable price. And it gets into some of the details on each of those individual steps when you're looking for a great company to invest in. Now, next on the list is not a book, but you can actually get them in book form, and those are the shareholder letters from Warren Buffett. Now, Warren Buffett is widely regarded as the greatest investor of all time. He runs Berkshire Hathaway. It's a very, very large public company, of which he still owns a very large percentage, and every single year he writes a detailed letter to his investors, and he writes it again in quite plain language, as if he was writing it to one of his sisters who had a shareholding in the company and really knew very little about investing. And they're really a timeless record of lessons that Buffett has given over many, many, many years. If you simply go on the BerkshireHathaway.com website, you'll find shareholder letters from Warren Buffett right back to the 1970s, but he was actually also writing letters for Berkshire when he first took over the company in the 60s. Those are a little harder to find, so I'll link them down in the description below. And even before that, in the 1950s, he was writing letters to partners in his private fund. I think once you've read through Invested, you should have a pretty good handle on some of the basic concepts of investing, and the Buffett letters will make a whole lot more sense after that point. You can obviously just read them on your computer or what have you. I prefer to read stuff physically, so I've got a bunch of them printed out here in sort of 5 or 10 year chunks of Buffett letters. So that's the way I've gone about it. But I think those letters are an unbelievably good resource for really investors of any level. Now, number 3 here is actually sort of an optional one, so let's call this maybe number 2.5, and that is Warren Buffett and the interpretation of financial statements. Now, the reason why I say this is optional is this is kind of a more technical book specifically on accounting and how to read financial statements. So if you're someone who's already pretty familiar with the basic concepts of accounting, you understand how an income statement or a profit and loss works, a balance sheet and a cash flow statement, and you understand kind of the inner workings of those different financial statements, you probably don't need to read that book. It is relatively basic, but it does go through the details and some of the nuances of basically every individual item on each of those 3 financial statements. That sounds super boring, but I actually did find that book more interesting than I thought I was going to when I went in and actually read it. So I'll put that one down as an optional one. If you don't feel as though you have a good understanding of accounting, which really is the language of business, that will be a great one to check out. If you feel you've already got a pretty good understanding of accounting, maybe it's one you can pass on. So after number 2.5, we have the real number 3, which is The Intelligent Investor by Benjamin Graham. And this feels to me like a really cheesy one to share on one of these videos. If you watch any sort of Warren Buffett interview where he recommends investing books, he still always says that The Intelligent Investor is the best investing book ever written. Benjamin Graham, the author of The Intelligent Investor, was Warren Buffett's teacher. And Buffett actually worked in Ben Graham's investment partnership for a couple of years as well. The copy of The Intelligent Investor I have here is the revised 4th edition. This book actually originally, the first edition came out in 1949. And for that reason, some of the principles in there, specifically around bonds and various things, are a little outdated, but many of the core principles are still incredibly valuable today. It can be a very dense read. Personally, I read The Intelligent Investor way too early in my investment journey, but once you've got the Buffett letters and particularly Invested out of the way, I think that should make a whole lot more sense. And frankly, like I say, some bits of it are a little outdated. So there's really 3 chapters in there that I think most people will get the most value out of. The first one is just chapter 1, which explains the difference between an investment and a speculation, which I think is a concept from Graham that you want to have very clear in your head, so I would definitely recommend that. And then you also have chapter 8 and chapter 20. Chapter 8 talks through market fluctuations and how an investor should react to that, and that's where ideas like the market is there to serve you, not to instruct you, come from. That's sort of sourced from Chapter 8 of The Intelligent Investor. And Chapter 20 is all about margin of safety and focusing on downside protection in your investments. A little like if you were to drive a 10-ton truck over a bridge, you wouldn't want that bridge to have a maximum capacity of 10 ton. You might want it to have a capacity of 20 or 30 ton. That's kind of margin of safety in engineering, and you really want to look for the same level of protection in your investments. Now, there's a saying that there can be no learning without action and no action without learning. And I think if you've got through all of those texts so far, you can have a pretty good understanding of how to go about investing in real companies. And I think it's at this point where you probably should take the time to look at a real company, and ideally a large one that you maybe interact with as a customer and likely understand that business pretty well already without doing a whole lot of research on the company. So I think at this point you probably want to go and do a couple of things with maybe one or two companies of your choice. That is to read an annual report and to listen to a conference call. Maybe from the last quarter that particular company reported their results for. So most large US companies, for example, will have quarterly investor calls where the CEO and wider management team gets up and explains the financial results they achieved, what they're thinking about going forward, and you often have investment analysts ask that particular management team questions about their business. So you might be an iPhone user, for example, and you might want to go and check out Apple's latest annual report and investor call, and that will give you some really good practical experience about what real results from a company look like, some of the things that management teams tend to say, and with all of that sort of background groundwork that you've picked up from these various books and letters, you should have a really good feel for the things that are coming out of their mouth or that they're writing about. So that would really be number 4 on the list for me. Pick out maybe one or two very large, well-followed companies that you probably already interact with in your day-to-day life. Go and read one of their annual reports and go and listen to their latest quarterly conference call. You should be able to simply find that on the investor relations page of those various companies. So you'll just need to Google, for example, Apple Investor Relations, and you should be able to track down all of that info. Now, the 5th and final one here is a book that I've actually only read quite recently, which is The Outsiders by William Thorndike. This is essentially 8 case studies of different public company CEOs, and more specifically public company CEOs that have really excelled at capital allocation. So capital allocation is simply taking the cash that a business generates each and every year and allocating that as a manager sees fit. So that might be paying a dividend, it might be acquiring a new business, it could even be selling a part of their business, and it's really trying to optimize the resources that a company has in order to generate the best results for shareholders. The book covers many very famous CEOs. Warren Buffett himself at Berkshire Hathaway is actually one of the chapters, but you also have people like Tom Murphy at Cap Cities and sort of the media space. You have John Malone at TCI, again kind of in the media business. You have Katharine Graham, one of the CEOs from back in the day of the Washington Post, and countless other CEOs covered in the book. At this point, you're quite likely to have a pretty good technical understanding of how businesses function. That should really help you understand sort of more of the human element and some of the decisions that these managers are making and how it impacts shareholders over the long term and ultimately money that you might have in a public company. You can keep an eye on what management teams and your investments are doing and make a really informed decision about whether you think that is good or bad for you over the long term. So that's a list from me of 5 different bits of recommended reading for the beginner investor. Like I say, this isn't a comprehensive list of all you'll ever need to read or even everything that you should read. Everyone's learning styles are a little bit different, and you might pick up things from these books that I didn't pick up and vice versa. But this covers a very wide range of investment principles, and I think if you can get your head around most of the things that are happening right through these resources, you're going to be in a better position than 99.99% of investors on the planet, probably. So I do hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please let me know down in the comments below and subscribe to the channel if you are new here. But that's it for me for this one, and I'll see you on the next video. Cheers.